to me. So it's my great pleasure to moderate this keynote session, and especially to welcome Professor Mei-Po Kwon, who's joining us via Zoom today. So she's a professor of geography and resource management at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And she studied urban planning at the University of California in Los Angeles and has obtained her doctorate from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Professor Kwon has received recognition for her contribution to social science scholarship, including being a fellow of the American Association of Geographers and the UK Academy of Social Sciences, for example. She has received numerous prestigious awards and grants and serves on the editorial boards of Tier 1 journals like Annals of the American Association of Geographers. Professor Kwon is an ideal keynote speaker for this workshop today, so we're really very grateful because she addresses health, transport, environmental and social issues in urban areas through the application of innovative geographic information system methods. She focuses on understanding how socioeconomic differences shape urban residents' everyday experiences, their perceptions, and the use of the built environment. So we can already see that some of the previous questions that were addressed will be the topic probably of her talk. So Professor Kwon's work brings aggregate data into conversation with data at very fine spatial scales in innovative ways. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk, and we particularly appreciate Professor Kwon making time today to speak to us and also to have joined us throughout this workshop and to be zooming in from Hong Kong. So the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your kind introduction. I'm extremely pleased to be able to visit you virtually and also talk about my work and some of my work. I mean, as I was preparing, I think I have so much to share, and then I really look forward to the whole day of workshop and actually meeting everybody in person some of the days. Yeah. So thank you again, and I appreciate the workshop and everything has been said. And what I want to focus on today is human mobility, individual context, and environmental exposures using a spatial temporal perspective. Can everybody hear me okay, or do I need to speak louder? Is it okay now?
It's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, good. Yeah. So what I come from, as a for the introduction, based on the introduction, is that I'm looking for geographic context and how people are interacting in space and place, and also how they expose to the different kinds of environment. And somebody was mentioning about the built environment, the natural, and also in particular important is the social environment to environmental justice. And then so it's what geographers think of context is an important notion, and environmental health and neighborhood effects. For example, when we look into health and well-being, and it's very important notions of concept. So, and I think that, then how to delineate it in space and time is what I want to focus on today. And I especially want to look into the critical role of time and human mobility in people's exposure to the contextual and environmental influences on them. And as you can alluded to, the time is something that we will be, leading it into different kinds of explanation of time and the like courses. Yeah. As an introduction, I think that when people are exposed to the environment and in GIS science or geospatial technology, we can model very well the different ways of modeling, and I'm not going to talk too much about that. For example, we have land use model to model air pollution. We can model radio frequency, and all this using 3D propagation models and very sophisticated model looking into the building geometry into account. However, when we are really thinking about behavior and the actual linkage and causality and actually linkage to the health effect, that is extremely difficult, because when we add human into the equation, and it's just like doesn't work most of the time. So what I want to talk about is maybe a few things today. even though that few things is pretty long, I think. First of all is that the spatial, geospatial technologies and analysis and how we make use of the state of the art of those, and then trying to look into so-called the causal pathway and on, contextual attributes, and also linking to outcome meaning, actually whether people are healthy or not, and also, looking into exposure to this contextual influence, and then looking into how social and physical environment are, why they are not, consistent result in the literature. And then I also want to look into the methodological challenges that is available, that actually most of them, articulated by me. Yeah, so then because I think that I will just pick those of course, there are many, but I think I will pick those to present, to think about, how geographers are very difficult to identify the relevant context. And then I will introduce mixed methods, how, quantitative, and, GIS methods, can also be incorporated and mixed into, and with a qualitative and looking into, a more deeper understanding of it. So it's just a very, work, a contextual, work in how environmental influences stress and health, for example. And then I think a lot of have been said, in the literature and also maybe in the workshop about residential segregation, how people, racial by race and, and socioeconomic positions. And then in place, there may be inequality in the distribution. And then how we are looking into, well, as a pathway that we can be looking into, for example, neighborhood physical environment, whole bunch of measurements, and the social environment, again, a whole bunch of measurements, and into the behavioral mediated and stress and health. And this is, like a conceptual model that we are usually based on to looking into environmental influence. And the social geographic exposure, for example, in the literature, again, there's a lot of studies in that pollution, pollutants, and radio frequencing, fast food, and restaurants, social depredation and crime. So in a deprived neighborhood, it's not very good for health, for example. And however, if it's disadvantages and that is maybe produce better health for the people that live there. And bike path, green space, blue space, and there are lots of positive in the built and natural and the social environment that people are looking for. However, the key point that I want to bring out is the relationship and association and the causal relationship are not always the same. Well, I mean, different groups, social groups may expect different ways of association. First of all, for example, the high income and the deprived people, disadvantaged people may react to different, environmental exposure in a very different way. And a lot of my research actually exhibit, that way. And also, even with the same group and with the same determinant, there's a lot of the time, and it is the relationship actually varies a lot, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So then what do we have in the technology? This is, like the 3D visualization that I made. And then in this visualization, we're tracking people every 10 seconds, like in space and time. This is Lexington, Kentucky in the United States. And so the third dimension is time. So it's a time geographic a conceptualization, and then except that we can only go up in the time, right? Because time we can only get older. And then and what we can do is that we can intersect with the environment in any space and any time and in any point in time. So and then we call this a spatial turn in health research, and we publish in Science. And why is this important? What is the important thing is that, first of all, now for spatial analysis, we have a whole new world. We can pretty much, looking into, well, GPS, this is GPS tracking. So it's to the lat long precision. And so we can have aggregation or spatial unit in any form that we like. We can aggregate in any way. And even in terms of time, we can trace, this is 7 days, right? But you can think about this time geographic construct as a lifelong. So, and some important moments in time, you can also do it as a time geographic, like 2-dimension space, and the third dimension is time. And now, as a temporal unit, we can actually aggregate that in any form, right? I mean, so this is a whole new world. And before, we are constrained by the census unit, and also maybe the time can be a year, can be a week, can be a day, but now we can actually have a seconds. Yeah. So then what I want to propose is that actually the geospatial technologies and analysis is not used to just like having big data. Like now we have a lot of data. Now we can track people and all the social demographic and their emotions, their stress, and all the biomarker, whether they are having stress or the heartbeat and etc. It's not just that, but I would like to challenge people that we are using this to challenge the concepts, the theory, and the methods in the environmental and geographical research and address complexity and uncertainties. And it's not, we can do more now because of this technology. It's not because it's just we have a lot more data, but we can be more sophisticated in our thinking and go into the details that we probably would not be able to in the past. So first of all, before I give you some examples, some of the examples, because as I go through all the examples, I say they're all pretty good examples, but but they are also in published papers. So if you're willing, then I can introduce you to more examples in the future. But in the beginning, I would like to talk about a few challenges in doing all this spatial analysis. The first one is so-called the modifiable area unit problem. And in doing spatial analysis on the environment and health, and one thing is that depending on the zonal scheme and the geographical scale, we may get a different answer in spatial analysis. And this is very important. We call it MAUP, M-A-U-P. And so, for example, the plot, like if we operate in census tract and census block, we can get a different answer. And especially the processes may work at different geographical scale differently. For example, if we look into, migration in an urban, small urban area, or in an international, scale would be very different. However, what is newer is that so-called the modifiable temporal unit problem that may be important for studying life course. And what is this? Is that, well, now, since we can aggregate not just by space, like a city, like a county, like a country, but we can also aggregate in time. So what does it mean is that, okay, so I'll introduce what this is first, and then I'll go back to the other problems. I mean, we have just too many problems, by the way. And so what this is that if we aggregate, in a time into different observations, then we may get a different answer. And this is the so-called the modifiable temporal unit problem. And also there's different ways we can segregate it. And also we can looking into the temporal boundary. For example, daily, weekly, monthly, or different kind of segregation or different boundaries. And eventually, when we compare the different clusters, that we actually can find a lot of uncertainty. We may get a very different answer. That's the problem, that we may be able to, we should be looking into. So when we say that, that is crime aggregated in certain places, and not just depending on how you aggregate in space, but also depending on how you aggregate in time. So that it really affected, how, like geographical analysis is demonstrated and what you found in your analysis. So again, I'm not going to go into too much details, but if we want to discuss it, or if you want to looking into the literature, I'll be very happy to introduce it to you. The second one is articulated by me actually in 2012. It's an uncertain geographic context problem. This is not about a scale or zonal. It's not like about, do you work on city level or block neighborhood level or county level. We are talking in terms of time, are you looking into seconds? Are you looking into days or week or year? Now we're talking about what is relevant. So what is the relevant space and time that you're looking into? And if you are not capturing the relevant context, you actually can get all the association and all your conclusion, different and maybe, false. You can have a very false conclusion. And that's really scary. And I can give you some examples. So for example, if we're looking into teens deviant behavior, so we are studying just the home. And well, the DNA may not be affected by the home, environment, but maybe it's by their peer in the shopping mall or at the school. So if you capture the space incorrectly, then we get false conclusion. And the time is my famous, time, example would be cancer. For example, if we're just looking into the environment, one lives at the current moment that with a cancer patient, and that may not be, because cancer is really a long process accumulated into different ways. And I will, discuss about some implication for the life course research in a little bit later. And so that is another challenge, about identifying, the relevant temporal context incorrectly. And that can be a big problem. And then the third one is the neighborhood effect averaging problem. By now, I think you'll probably say, I don't want to hear any more problem. So there's a lot of problems. I'm sorry. Yes, and this one is one of the magnifications of the uncertain geographic context problem. It's talking about when you add mobility, people are actually moving around. And if you're just looking into the home neighborhood, a static neighborhood, the environment right there, and you may get everything wrong because people are moving around. And eventually, it can be all gathered into an average, because people will only move to places, high influence places, go to a lower one, and then eventually it's an average. And then that means that, the influence is not real. So I think that I will explain that to the extent that I can. Yeah. Okay. So I think, so then, my key point is that mobility is essential, especially for mobility dependent environmental influence. And then geographers can advance to the temporal integrated analysis of health behavior and health outcome through the careful examinations of people's everyday experiences as their lives unfold in space and time. So then what are the temporal dimensions that can be important? I think that obviously we just talk about in this workshop consistently, we talk about the life course, the cumulative exposure, the whole life, and the total duration of exposure over a certain long periods of time or over the whole life course. But it can be also momentary. So how to capture that? We have a lot of capturing means, and in a lot of my research and talking about actually the moment, how you feel can be affected. For example, noise pollution, air pollution. We found that the momentary, or shortly after the exposure really matters when you hear bomb, and then it really give you a lot of stress, for example. There's also a recency and time lag responses may occur a certain period of time after exposure. My work on heavy drug abuse people, drug users, heavy drug users, and demonstrate this, it's only 4 or 5 hours later, consistently, they are affected by the environment, the physical and built and social environment. And then this is, again, I don't have time to explain that research, but the time lag response, is very evidence, in that research. Episode of frequency and how frequent people is exposed to the environment influence matters. In well-being research, people are saying that if you go to, the park once, like I went to the park yesterday, so you may be, happy, but for your long-term well-being, and that is actually you have to frequently visit the parks. So that's why I'm not, happy all the time, maybe because I don't go to the park very frequently, for example. And then this duration, how long you are staying there. So it's all kinds of complexity that we actually can work with, in terms of the dimensions. And this is, a more, life course, perspective about health is that we are exposing to external exposures. And then maybe also started, with a long time. And my, one of the examples about is that on the cancer research, for example. And then, we find out that, it's important for cancer researchers to look into cancer on the onset. Of course, it's important, but also whether to follow, the person, over when is it onset, but of course the influence and the exposure may be before the onset. And then that needs to be, investigated, but also, and how they were treated and whether they're successful. Some, of course, are successful and some are relapse, of the cancer. And then one, new field is called financial toxicity. It's because a lot of the people, especially after getting the onset of cancer, they got financially very bad off because it's so expensive to heal, to treat, and then so maybe life situation, they got a divorce and become single and move to poor neighborhood that's less resources and further away from from the health resources like doctors and clinics and hospital that can treat them, and becoming worse and worse. So following all this and the environment is a big thing, and economic, socio-economic, and also the geographic environment is important. So then then what are we thinking about their place and space that we need to be following? And the WHO say, well, where they live is important. Of course, where they live, the neighborhood is important. But also, I would say that, it's not just the static, it's where they go is also very important. So, for example, so I think at NIH, US NIH, the National Institute for Health, and when I talk with the National Cancer Institute, I propose that we should look into residential histories of people. So that is following people over a life course where they live, not just where they live at that moment when they fill out, the survey or fill out and then that concept was captured into a funding, mechanism, and they are using commercial database call for giving out fundings for, cancer research that looking into, residential histories about that and tracing people. And then so in the US we have a Nexus database, and they approved officially by the NIH. However, in a deeper investigation of the database that are used, and then we found very differential ascertainment of the residential history. For example, when we use cohort study to compare the racial ethnicity minorities, and we found less information, we found a very heavy selection and information biases. Yeah, so the racial and ethnic minorities are, when compared to the non-Hispanic white, are underrepresented, and the information are not as good as the white people. So that means that if you're looking into the exposure and then the health outcome and try to find out policy, that everything is lacking behind. So this is one aspect of it. And the other aspect is the uncertain geographic context problem. So we think that, this is the red is the official census, track of where the person lives, but the blue is the perceived, the mental map, and then but the actual behavior actually all around the blue, the green dot. So identifying the right geographic context is extremely difficult, and I would like to propose, the spatial uncertainty in the actual area that exact the contextual influence under the study and the temporal uncertainty I just mentioned, right? Cancer, we are looking into, well, the onset, maybe even the onset is not most important, it's whatever happened before the onset was the most important. For the drug abuse, a study that I was looking into, not the moment that people are taking drugs, but actually when people getting into stress and craving for drugs was more important. So the temporal uncertainty is very difficult to capture. So again, I'm just bringing out the problem. Actually, I did attempt to solve some of this problem. So I hope that, let me look at the time. I hope I can get to that within my talk. Yeah. So, but it's very important methodological problem, because it means that the analytical results can be different for different delineations. If you use a static official administrative unit like census, then you may get it wrong because nobody follow the census to do anything. And that the temporal also, if you just capture the right moment. So this is a real case of our study in Indianapolis, Indiana, again in the United States. We are looking into teenage girls' risky sexual behavior. And this teenage girl said, really it's not like even a polygon and anything similar to the census static unit, but she told us the most relevant, like context for her is her grandmother's backyard where she was small. When she was before, she was a teenager, and then she, was influenced in that particular place. And of course, like we did in-depth interview plus surveys with the whole group. Yeah. So again, all these studies, are published, and then you're welcome to read them. But all I want to point out is that if you have the contextual unit incorrectly, you can have spatial analysis false positive. When you found relationship, actually it's not true. And when you don't find the relationship, and with the contextual unit, meaning that place and then the health outcome, but actually it may actually be there. You just don't find it because it's the contextual unit was wrong. So I think I'm going to skip examples. This is just an example about if we ignore mobility, people are actually moving around, because most of the time people are getting influenced, not just right at their home, especially for some, thing, then they're sleeping most of the time at home, but they are also going outside. So this is about air pollution. And then this is a study about if we're looking into hourly movement data or daily movement data, and also just the residents and hourly and daily, the result, the contextual inference are all different. So I'm going to do this very quickly, because there's no, I'm aware also of the time. So another one that is a related, but a different, a kind of different problem is, I call that the neighborhood effect averaging problem. So what this is that it's a problem that if you're looking into, for example, air pollution affecting, humans' health, then the individual mobility-based exposure tends to towards the mean level of the participant, because people, especially is mobility dependent, like if it's a social capital, then I don't think it matters. But if it's a mobility based, mobility dependent exposure is very important, because, people are moving around. So graphically, maybe easier to understand. When you are when someone is at a lower exposure level, tends to amplify, upward averaging, because it tends to, when they move around, it tends to go to the higher level. And when they are at already very high, then they tend to go to the low. And eventually, there's an effect of averaging effect. And then it tends towards the mean. And then what is the significance of this problem? It's not just you identify the unit wrong. It's more importantly is that actually the environment doesn't matter, because eventually, it's an event, it's an averaging, right? So the significance actually in implication for studying this disadvantages group is actually who is not averaging, who is not averaging, for example, if they're already high, who is not moving to places that can lesser that disadvantage, right? And that can have a very big social policy implication. So for example, this is again some evidence that this is happening, the NIP is happening. And so I don't, all this are data and a proof of this problem. Again, I'm going to skip all this wording, heavy wordings, because, but I think I told you the concept. So then who is not averaging? So in a study using big data, social treats, in the United States of 50 largest cities, the residents of primary Black neighborhood and Hispanic neighborhoods, whether they are poor or not, are far less exposed to either non-poor or white middle class neighborhood than the residents of the primary white neighborhoods. So when people are moving around, we think that, well, eventually they should be moving to, like if they're already all white, maybe moving to, predominant, maybe Black or low income neighborhood. However, they found that, and then maybe they're already very, heavily affluent minority, maybe the more likely they're going to the white neighborhood. But this study actually using geotected data, with geocode, big data, they're looking into, even though, first of all, they're not moving to the white neighborhood or richer neighborhood with more resources. And even the residents of the disadvantaged people are travel far and wide. So this is really worrisome. So they're moving, but they're not moving to lesser their disadvantage. So then we are thinking about, a lot of the time is that, well, you're moving, then how can you assess to the interaction? So we Yu Ming Park, my former PhD student, and I, we also built, like also the beyond the residential segregation when people are moving and are the people who are different, for example, racially segregated people are moving together and then become less segregated. So we built an index. Again, this is all published, and then you can look into the date, the index, the papers for more details. So for example, when people, again, this is a space-time path, right? Traveling in time 1 to time 5. I is a person going through. And then the daily path with many people are also moving at the same time, right? So at time 1, then P, person 1 and 2 and 3 are near this person I, but at time 5 and the other time, then maybe the other people are near them. So are they, whether they are, so, and then we'll build an index, a different segregation index that is looking into the social interaction, and then also so basically looking into both spatially and temporally, who are with them, at the same time, and are they different people? Are they, for example, who are approximate, and then the average intergroup proximity waged by each group's fraction in all K neighborhoods. The K can be divided by the user in a specific time period. So this is, and then this index is a very simple and easy interpretation to be, smaller than 1 can be closer to other groups, and then, if it's, equals to 1, that is no racial clustering, and also if it's larger than 1, that is closer to the other groups. Yeah, so we can measure in that way using, different kinds of data. Okay, so I think that is looking into space-time movement, but also interacting with other groups. And then you can say whether the other people in your closest neighbor, in your nearest neighbor, are they with your same group? Are they with the same race, or are they with, a different income or the same kind of income? So you can measure in that kind of way. However, the segregation and everyday encounter, we know that in terms of nearby doesn't mean that they're interacting, and even they're interacting, and doesn't mean that they're interacting in a meaningful way. So the geographies of encountering also examine how social differences may be dissolved through a process of mixing and hybridization of culture as a result of everyday encounters in the interaction in public space. And so, for example, this study of Poor Single Mother by Martin Dice and her and his former student again, and then they looking into qualitatively, they express the feelings like humiliations, discomfort, disrespect, and all kinds of vulnerability while traveling in San Francisco using across and different space. And then even though they are together nearby, and in our measure maybe they are actually kind of interacting, but it can be also harmful for their well-being. It can go in another way. So the intersectionality on multiple axes of difference, for example, gender, age, race, class, sexual orientation, disability, and religions, etc., can be important of actually understanding of this. A less segregated environment does not necessarily means exposure to social disadvantage, and may mean more intensive exposure to systematic racism or various intersectional discriminatory practices or oppressive encounters, and go beyond spatial proximity of social groups to fully understand people's spatial temporal experience of marginalizations, discrimination, and social isolation is very important, and then examine how oppressive power relations purview the microspaces and times of the everyday encounter can be very important. And then you can say, well, then how geospatial technologies and analysis and how your study can actually do that. And then I would like to introduce one of my attempts again. It's called the geonarrative, and to looking into the absence and the silence. Because a narrative inquiry is a qualitative means analysis, and inquire useful for discovering and preserving the experience of ordinary people and studying the hidden histories of geographies and the place-based lives and memories of the disadvantaged people. So, and then I call it geonarrative because I add, the GIS infrastructure. I built in 3D visualization in 2008 with Guo Changding, my former PhD student. We integrated GIS with qualitative data capability on visualization, both spatial and temporal dimension, to express, people's feelings and emotions. And we build qualitative data analysis and capability within GIS. And this is actually a very long work. Then we spent 3 years on it and really working. And then we published this paper on the method. And of course, we have other examples that I will talk about later on. And narrative handles the chronologies of people's experience and the sequence of events. So this is very suitable for studying, for example, life course. And it integrated a variety of geographic data and narrative materials. And it can be autobiography, or also it can be other kind of narratives. And because when we integrate with GIS, the geo, by geographers, then so we're actually adding geographic context that facilitate the interpretations and understanding of the lived experience of the research participant, and add spatial reasoning and understanding of the place, and for analysis of narratives in the history. So this is, one of our work in the female sex worker in Tijuana in the U.S.-Mexico border, and this is of course, collaborative work with, health professionals, public health, and we're actually using a mixed method for not just that we are using participatory mapping subjects, like the participants are, mapping what they feel about, the homework, females work, sex work and drugs that go hand in hand in those places. We do quantitative surveys looking into the venue characteristic, that is the work of sex work. And also we do, venue field work, going to study the field observation and the activity diary, and then also qualitative interviews. And in especially important, we use geonarrative. And it's actually very innovative. We got funding the first time we submitted the proposal to US NIH. Yeah. So again, this is my work in the female for the Muslim woman after September 11. And I can only highlight, of course, there's a lot of years of work, and then of course there's a lot of richness to this. But I would like to highlight some, important points in the interest of time. So first of all, we use the time geographic. So the space-time path, is the third dimension is time, so it can go over. So if we click, we can have a multimedia representation of how the environment feels. For example, the mosque is important to the Muslims' fear of the landscape after September 11, and the color code representing how they feel about this. And then we use the narrative, the coding on, usually the coding only for, textual materials, but we are also coded and visualized it in space and time and analyzed it in space and time. For example, next to my parents' home at night at 10, how do they feel about fearing to go out? Because we want to have a visualization and also analysis of the urban landscape of fear for the Muslim woman. And, right after September 11, everything is, fear. But for after a certain period of time, then, the trajectory is becoming green, the home feel a little bit safer, outside is not too safe, and the airport is very unsafe to them. And also the places that, most Muslims get harassed, then they're also feeling not safe. And what I want to say that, in summary, the temporal dimension is that before and after September 11 in the narrative analysis is very important. So this is a very important juncture of them, not to mention about the spatially. And for the female sex worker, again, there's a lot of richness to this, but we use geonarrative to analyze the sex work. And a lot of the time, again, the important time is that when they get deported from the US, because they're mostly illegal immigrant go into the US, but because they're illegal, so they get deported. So getting to the border cannot really go home because they are feeling ashamed, not bringing a lot of money to the small villages going home. So they got stuck in the border and get stuck with sex work and drugs. And then they, however, what they're facing is, structural violence and vulnerability. And the border region is the presence of increasing risk of HIV, because they're sex workers, so they are also spreading out to the US and Mexico. So what I want to highlight about geographic context and also, the uncertain geographic context problem. What is important, we find that in space, it's not really the female sex workers' home, because they may not even have a home, stable home. Because they are always getting chased after and harassed by the police, and so they are not really stable. They're moving their home a lot, and also sex work, even though it's legal in Mexico, but the license is very expensive. When they lose the license, they're actually moving to the red light district, to further away. And that is not like having police patrolling and then they got harassed by their clients, because now they are, not in, so-called their, safe place, watched by their, peers, for example. Temporally, what is important is that the deportation is really important, in their lives, and of course, we also look into the venue. And so the movement of this sex worker in time, because of financial situation, they got less money and they cannot afford the license because police violence, and they cannot go to the pharmacy, even though the resources are all available around them, but they cannot go because they're not, they may have money to buy the condom to protect themselves, but they are actually afraid of police harassment in those places. Are very important, information about geographic context. So the GPS trajectory look into where they go, but where they don't go actually is actually much more important in the geographic context. So this is related back to my uncertain geographic context problem. We don't look into the pharmacy as important for the female sex worker, because they actually cannot get access to it, even though they may be proximate, very nearby, because of all kinds of oppressive power relations that is prevail. So in summary, I cannot get into the study too much, but in terms of the method, I think that we conclude that the mixed methodology is feasible to implement, and I would like to classify GIS as a third method. It's not just quantitative, it's not just qualitative, but it's also third. And then when we are mixed them together, then we're actually looking into kind of good result. So in conclusion, again, so I can say a lot more about each one, and then a lot more other, about all this. But however, I think in the interest of time, I would like to leave some time for questioning. Mobility is important, but we need to take care of different of social groups. For example, sometimes when I talk about NEEP, the neighborhood, effect averaging problem. So if everybody is averaging their disadvantage and advantage, then it can be, there's no neighborhood effect, right? So this is done. However, the social policy should be looking into who is not averaging. So in actually in the two, already, I think it's already published paper, because I think it was forthcoming, but I think now it's at least online. One is published in the annals of the AAG, and the other one is environmental research, is looking into who is not averaging. And it's our finding is that, the low income women, aged people, and unemployed that are not averaging. And then the remaining in that disadvantaged position, even though mobility can be increased. So this is, of course, people without mobility are disadvantaged. I think that would be, like the disabled. I think there's lots of literature confirming that. But what is important is that even people mobile, they can still not averaging, in a way. So that is a big concern. And even they're mobile, the interaction may not be meaningful. And especially for a lot of the vulnerable social groups, like the Muslim women in the United States, and also the female sex worker in the US-Mexico border, the effect of the mobility to the environmental influence a lot of the time tend to operate in the opposite directions as they expected to the other social groups. For example, health resources like pharmacy, like like a lot of clinics are not available to female sex workers because they're constantly being harassed by different other power, in another oppressive power relations. And then we need explicit social policy and interventions to address this inequality and integration, and use smart data, technologies, and new methods. If in the right way, I think we can analyze behavior and improve health and well-being of all citizens. And again, in conclusion, I think that we at least need to move from the location. We are not just putting a dot on the map using GIS. Oh, I got the geocode there, and it's a lat long, it's this and that. But we need to look into movement, from static, geographic unit to mobility, and from space to space-time. In the final analysis, humans are active agents who construct their own geographic context and tie together different spatial and temporal scales through their everyday activities, movements, and social interactions. And the interconnections among individuals and places are vastly complex and vibrantly dynamic, and they should be conceptualized and examined as such. And that will end my talk. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. I'm done. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This was a fantastic talk. I'm very happy to have you with us. And we have plenty of time, I think, for questions. So I open the floor for anyone who's in the room to speak up, or online. Please feel free to either raise your hand or put questions in the chat. So anyone wants to ask a question?
I can ask a question.
Yes. Is it understandable? Yes.
Yeah.
Speak loud.
Go speak up.
So we have Jordi in the room.
Professor Kwon. My name is Jordi Nakes. I'm an economist at the Melbourne Institute. Maybe good to mention here in the interdisciplinary audience. So I worked a bit on the MAUP, so the modifiable areal unit problem. So the temporal unit problem is a new thing for me. So that's very interesting. But I was wondering, so the MAUP matters a lot. That is that we know that, but matters this spatial time distinction? Does that matter even more or matter less? So my hunch is that time, depending on the research question and the data you use to define spatial units, that often doesn't matter at all. But yeah, I'm curious whether you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Again, this is actually relatively new. I think more has been studied, and then including yourself, and then it's still a very important problem in many of the cases. The temporal one is actually new, but I think I would imagine that if, so for example, I feel that, in my studies, for example, I study air pollution using every seconds. So what do you think if I aggregate into minutes, into, we found out that into, different kinds of days, or, hourly or years, can also find, in the spatial analysis, it's actually very different. And I would actually like the people who study intensively life courses that to tell me, if they are, if the temporal unit are modifiable, and what is the implication? Yeah, so I think that it's a good question, but unfortunately, I mean, it's new to me, and then I'm starting to look into this research, and I don't have too much, to say. But as I have said, I'm more, using the uncertain geographic context problem, those kind of things. Yeah, that is what is relevant. Yeah, so I think. Did I, answer your question? I guess not.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but in the study, in the paper that I cite, it matters a lot in terms of crime clustering, because when they try to use different kinds of aggregation and segmentation into and boundary into crime cluster, and then the result are totally uncertain, different. Yeah. So I think that I can just cite that paper to answer your question. Yeah. So I think it's a new field, kind of new. So I think that we need more maybe empirical studies to it. Yeah.
So maybe as a quick follow-up, I was wondering, how do you deal with all this big data? How do you deal with data access and sharing and ethics? And is it also available to us, for example?
Oh, the ethics, yeah, sure, yeah. So, so for example, the drug, heavy drug using, ethic document was 150 pages. So, and then so I spent a lot of time on taking care of those, and because I deal with very sensitive data, if people find we have the location of them where they deal drugs, they trust us. So everything is that we build up trust. We go to the community, we talk with these people, we use months to build up our trust, and then to get all this very detailed information. We know where people deal drugs, we know how female sex workers solicit clients, and how the whole process of their sex work. So we got very extremely sensitive kind of data. So how do we do that? First of all, obviously we have to protect this kind of data in a secure server, and we have different kind of way of encryption and all that, but also we promise not to share and all those things. Yeah. So and I think that when we present the data, we can only present it in a aggregate form, or not present it at all, using simulated data to present the idea. But we of course can talk about the result. Yeah.
I think we actually have a question in the chat that goes exactly into that same direction from Renee. So I don't know, Professor Kwan, if you can see the questions in the chat. It's asking actually precisely, when working with big data, how can we overcome computing capacity issues that's associated with analyzing that detailed data, but also whether there's a danger that comes with the access to such detailed data, making people think that that small units of analysis are always better, and maybe making these issues more of a problem. So it goes very much in the same direction, I think. Maybe.
Yeah. So so I mean, so first of all, the computing capacity issues right now are actually easier to solve because we have supercomputer. I mean, I also have some, analysis, like GIS analysis. Like one of my former PhD students would like to buffer every single GPS point, and then we got into computational issues, and we then go to apply for allocation from our supercomputer center. So that was an issue. But normally, I think that we can handle with computer very well. So at micro temporal spatial, but again, all. The current, GIS student may be well on, those, machine learning, big data, parallel processing kind of a technology. So my student obviously can go to those classes and make use of those computers. So I don't think that is a, outrageously important issue. But the second part of the question is that I would look at it as not the smaller, the better. Is what is the appropriate analysis. And as you can see, I go from quantitative to GIS to micro level to qualitative, all kinds. And not because I'm switching, but because I'm using the most appropriate one. I have a research question. I want to find out something, and that whatever is appropriate that I do, whatever that doesn't exist, I create. And that's my approach. Yeah. So it doesn't exist. Then so I say, okay, but we need that to study the real meaning, the explanation, and the relationships. Then I try to build that, myself. And of course, usually takes quite a long time. So it's not just the smaller, the better, even though in scale, in MOB, one of the person, the audience said that he studied MOB. And we are not talking about the smaller, the better. We're talking about an optimal scale, right? So, I mean, and I teach a class, and usually I taught a class that is talking about how do you find the optimal scale. So, so I don't think that the smaller, but but we can start with small. If we can capture small, then we can always aggregate to bigger, right? But we start with big, then it's difficult to go down, I think, yeah. To disaggregate is more difficult, yeah. Even though it's possible, but it's not so feasible, yeah. So I like to have a more detailed kind of data, yeah. But they're not, I would say big, not in terms of volumes and computational, but because of the variety. Yeah, the big, the V's, the 5 V's, 3 V's, 4 V's, whatever people call it, it's not because of the volume. We actually can handle using, normal computer capacity. It's more of the variety, the complexity of the data that I'm interested in, the so-called, I call the quote and unquote big data. Not because it's a lot of them, because usually a lot of them, they don't have, for disadvantaged people, they don't have income, they don't have gender, and they are deprived of all the socioeconomics. So what I usually cannot use those data because they are not too meaningful to me. Yeah, I mean in my research. Yeah.
I think.
Is that okay?
If we have time for one more final question?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I think there is one in the chat asking about whether you have any advice on how to design build environment interventions from the individual and personalized environment health effects from your studies.
Oh, okay. So
interventions.
Yeah, it's a very good question, I think. Yeah, so I think that it looks like individualized, but I'm talking about also it's a research design, right? So from the quantitative point of view, we need to, when we have a research question, we need to select a sample. I mean, we have to have a sampling strategy, and then the sample should be representative of the population that we are studying. So it's not like random individuals, like I grab my friends to do my study and then I just get the numbers, For strictly quantitative sampling, it's actually very rigorous. Every proposal that I get funded needs a lot of justification for the sample, and especially for health research, they need power calculation. That means that you have enough. Is your sampling strategy valid, and do you have enough people to represent your sample? So it's not really just like very individual, even though I did talk at the individual level. And so in terms of the built environment, I think, again, it really depends what you're studying on. If you're thinking about walkability, I think that you also need to be thinking about a spatial sampling. So to looking into different kinds of built environment and then be able to compare them so that you can have a more, more certain, way of talking about policy. Because for policy, you cannot just say, oh, I found one person and this person is like this. So that is more quantitative. Yeah. For qualitative, the purpose is not to have a representative, so-called in terms of the statistical significance sense, but it's more for explanation and understanding. So I think that I have them a lot more very well qualified, qualitative researcher here than can talk about that. But what I propose, in my study is mixed method. So I think that we can complement all this, and then the geospatial technology can come into this way, and then to make a very rich, analysis, and then have more confidence when we are proposing social policy. Again, I hope that I answer your question. Yeah. Is it okay? Yeah.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sangeeta here. I just have one more question, if that's okay. I think we still have a few minutes.
Sure.
Thank you for an excellent presentation, and really stands out your very synthetic approach across a variety of methods. It's extremely impressive. So my question is, how do you go about, when you build these research projects, how do you go about building interdisciplinary teams and applying these different methods? Do you have people who are across all the different methods, or do you have to find different researchers to apply different methods? And just any experience of some of the challenges that in building those interdisciplinary teams?
Yeah, so I think I would say that I would answer in two flows. One is that, I actually pick up both myself. So I really spend a lot of time. As you can see that I don't really sleep. I do a lot of qualitative work. And so when I build the geonarrative, I combine, and I also do GIS, of course, a PhD student helped me, but basically I combine those research. And so those are, for me, the platform. And because I think that if you trace my so-called epidemiology trajectory, that I actually go from, I bring in, qualitative analysis into GIS and bring in feminism, into visualization. So I think that I like to combine both. And so how do I go by? I just have to be, good at both, right? And then, but however, there's a lot of research that, which is true, that is interdisciplinary research. It's big team. I cannot do it all by myself. For example, when we say female sex worker, and there's a lot of HIV knowledge over there, then how people actually get infected and how do they cure cancer research. Of course, I need to bring in people, medical doctor and public health. And then how do I build? I think we started with a very, so actually I would say that, most of the time is that because I like to bring out geography and geospatial technology into, the project. And then I can say that this actually helped a lot. For example, you can say that the uncertain geographic context problem, a lot of public health people are doing very well in neighborhood research or environmental influence, environmental health, and there's lots of good research. But when I came out and tell them, if you just make an arbitrary buffer around people's home and use the census tract up as their neighborhood, you're getting everything wrong. And they're like, oops, So in the beginning, I bang at the table, say that this is wrong. And then after 3 days in the NIH panel, then they are banging at the table and said that is wrong already. So because they learn, right? And then I become an integral part, and we can build an interdisciplinary dialogue on research. Accessibility is also the same thing. I told them proximity doesn't mean accessibility. Social proximity doesn't mean, non-segregated neighborhood or social interaction. So, and then the first day I can put it in the panel and criticize, the proposals that say they only measure distance as a geographic variable. But the second day and the third day, the public health, the medical people, and they are banging on the table and say, distance doesn't mean, proximity doesn't mean accessibility. So, oops, that's my point, and they're taking my point. So I think that, how I build it is that, first of all, I found out what is most important in geography and geographic concept that is very important in certain interdisciplinary research program, like health, for example, just say health and accessibility. And then without our contribution, they can get everything wrong and not really getting to the point. So our contribution is major. It's not just a technician. I never would work on a project if I'm just a technician. Just like I know the technology, so and you don't, so I can help you. And that's not the right attitude. It's that my concept and what I'm telling you is actually major, also a major part. And then let's collaborate. And then we build up, then we bring in sociology, and we bring in health scientists, we bring in medical people who understand the disease, and then we work together. I don't know whether I answer your question. Yeah,
that's a great
long answer.
Yes.
It's a long answer about your question, but we can talk more. Yeah, we can talk more.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yes, I think that was actually a perfect last question and great answer, with giving us many aspects that we can pick up again later, where we actually will talk in a session about how to do interdisciplinary spatial research. So I think these were some really great aspects. I would like to invite everyone to join me in thanking Professor Kwon again for this excellent keynote lecture. And we also have, we also have a gift voucher for you as a sign of our appreciation, which you'll receive via email, I think, very shortly afterwards. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. I think I hand back to Sangeeta for
Kate. Actually, can you take a break
for doing the breakout rooms.
Hi, thank you everyone for your great questions and fantastic participation. We are going to separate now into some breakout rooms for discussion. As with yesterday, the group here in Melbourne do need to physically relocate. So if you're online, feel free to take a few minutes to stretch your legs. And when you join back, we'll have a breakout room ready for you to join. Thank you.
That's great.